Welcome to this video on protecting our food supply. We are going to talk about foodborne illness and the ways that you can prevent foodborne illness. First, we're going to talk about how microbial food poisoning can be prevented, and we are going to identify some foods that are particularly troublesome or more likely to cause foodborne illness. So let's just talk about some common foodborne organisms or organisms that can make you sick when you eat food. The first one is Salmonella. Most of you are probably familiar with this. This is a microorganism that's commonly found in poultry and eggs and can cause foodborne illness. The next one is Campylobacter. Campylobacter is also found in poultry, but it's also often found in contaminated water and unpasteurized milk. Sometimes this is called the picnic microorganism, and that's because when people take picnics, they're more likely to drink contaminated water, say from a stream or a river that is by the picnic area. E. coli is another microorganism. It's found in undercooked ground beef, and it's also found in unpasteurized milk and juice, and also raw produce. E. coli is quite deadly. It causes a lot of severe problems. It can cause bloody diarrhea, severe cramps, dehydration, and it can also lead to kidney failure and death. There have been some outbreaks of E. coli in recent years. There's actually been an outbreak in peanut butter and spinach, which previously were uncommon sources, but that E. coli was coming usually from, say on the spinach, from contaminated water that had fecal material in it. The next one we're going to talk about is hepatitis A. This is actually a virus, and the most common transmission of hepatitis A is from person to person. So it's from a person who has hepatitis A that's maybe working in a food service establishment and they have a cut or a wound and they don't get that covered and that transfers to food. Or we can have fecal oral transmission where a food service worker uses the restroom and they don't wash their hands really well afterwards, and then they can transmit that hepatitis A to food that they're preparing or serving. Staphylococcus is also often passed on from people to the food system. That's because this is often found in cuts or pimples. So an example of where this can happen is maybe you have a worker in a sandwich shop and maybe they take their hands to push their hair away from their face, but they've got a pimple or on their face, and as they push that away, then they get the contamination that has the Staph aureus in it. And if they don't wash their hands or put new gloves on and they touch food, that can contaminate the food. Botulism is a deadly toxin that can cause foodborne illness. Usually comes from improperly home canned foods, foods that are done in large facilities at a manufacturing plant have very little risk for developing botulism. Botulism is interesting because it likes to grow in a no oxygen environment and it likes to grow with low acid. So vegetables are low acid, and if you can them and you create a no oxygen environment, and that botulism can grow. So to prevent botulism, people who home can need to follow tested recipes that use the right temperature and the length of time to process those foods to prevent botulism. The way botulism causes problems is it can cause a paralysis that can actually lead to death within 24 hours if it's not treated. An interesting thing about botulism is honey can have a botulism spore in it that adults can break down or destroy in the GI tract with the acid, but children cannot. And so you don't feed honey to an infant that is less than a year old because they can't break that down. Now, there are a few things that we aren't going to talk about in this course related to these microorganisms that are what are the symptoms. So each of these organisms have or causes different symptoms. A lot of them cause nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, but some of them cause a fever, some of them don't. You don't need to know that. And the other thing that you don't need to know that we won't discuss in detail is how long it takes for symptoms to occur. For example, with Salmonella, you can get symptoms within 1 to 3 days, but with hepatitis A, we really don't see symptoms for about 30 to even 60 days. Now with microorganisms, they only need 3 basic things to grow. They need warmth, they need moisture, and they need nutrients. And that's why foods pose a risk, because if our foods get too warm, let's say we cook some spaghetti for dinner and then we don't keep it hot, but it's still warm, that's moist, and there are nutrients there for the microorganisms to grow, we can grow microorganisms on our food. There are some foods that are a little more risky than others, and so let's talk about that. First are meats, fish, and poultry that are undercooked. If they're cooked well, we don't have as big a risk, but if you start cooking them not to a high enough temperature, then that means that the microorganism can grow on these foods. And we are going to talk later on in this video about what temperatures you need to cook food to. Another risky food is melon. This is because they're grown down on the ground. And on the ground, we use manure, which is fecal matter from animals, as fertilizers, and that can get onto the melon. And if you think about a cantaloupe, it has little grooves on it, and that manure can get in the grooves. And then if you don't wash the melon well and you slice through the melon, you can smear all that dirt and manure onto the melon, which can then have microorganisms on it that you consume and you get sick. We've talked about honey. This is really only a problem for infants because adults are protected by the stomach acid, but infants are not, and so they can get infant botulism from honey. So we just don't serve honey to infants less than a year old. Another category of risky foods are foods grown close to the ground, like we talked about with the cantaloupe, say spinach or lettuce. This also has to do with the manure and the fecal matter that we can get on this food, but also a lot of times we use, well, we do use water. A lot of times we use water to water these crops to grow, and sometimes that water, as it runs to the ground, can pick up contaminants and contaminate the food. That was the case with an E. coli outbreak with spinach. It came from contaminated water on the spinach with that. Sprouts are risky because of the way that sprouts are made. When you take sprouts, you take a seed such as an alfalfa sprout and you put it in a warm environment and a moist environment, and then that will sprout. And if you recall, bacteria needs warmth, moisture, and nutrients to grow, and that's just exactly what we have with sprouts. In my work at a pediatric hospital, we actually serve no sprouts anywhere on the menu, not even in our cafeteria, because of their high risk for having foodborne illness. Okay, another category, cooked vegetables and cooked grains, because once you cook them, you add moisture to it. So if you cook rice or you cook pasta, you've added moisture, and now the bacteria can grow more. So if you cook vegetables and grains, you want to consume them within 2 hours of cooking them, or you want to store them in the refrigerator and make sure that the temperature is lowered so that the bacteria doesn't grow as quickly. And then lastly, we have unpasteurized juice and unpasteurized milk. Pasteurization is a heat process that can be used to kill some microorganisms, and so when we don't pasteurize these foods, they are a higher risk. Most milk and juice is pasteurized, and you can look right on the label, it will say pasteurized. Now, while anyone can get foodborne illness, we do have groups that are more likely to get foodborne illness, and these are groups that we want to be extra careful with in preventing foodborne illness, and we're going to talk about ways to prevent that in just a little bit here. But especially vulnerable groups are pregnant women, infants and children, older adults, and people with a weakened immune system, such as somebody who has cancer, or maybe they've had a transplant, or they have HIV. So let's really talk about how do we prevent foodborne illness. Well, there are 4 areas that you can use to prevent foodborne illness. They're clean, separate, cook, and chill. Let's talk about each of these in more detail. Cleaning is the first one. This includes like washing your hands, washing utensils, washing surfaces. That all limits the microbial growth and helps keep our food safe. So let's do an activity. I want you to start rubbing your hands together to pretend like you're washing your hands, and I want you to keep doing this until I say stop. All right? On your mark, get set, and start washing your hands. Okay, just keep washing them until I tell you to stop. Keep going. Keep going for a little bit longer. Okay, stop. Now that was 20 seconds. To appropriately wash your hands, you first need to wet your hands and apply soap. Okay, so the soap and the water will help provide a friction. And then you need to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. Most people do not wash their hands that long. 20 seconds is about the length of time it takes to sing the alphabet song or to sing the happy birthday song twice. And then after you wash your hands, you rinse them and you dry them with a clean towel, not a towel that's been in your kitchen for a long time that you've been using, but like a paper towel or a clean towel. Along with cleaning is keeping surfaces clean. So you want to keep your hands clean, but you want to keep your surfaces clean, like countertops. Now, there are some ways you can do this. One is you want to sanitize your surfaces, so countertops, cutting boards, or those types of things. The easiest thing you can use is bleach, and you can just mix a teaspoon of bleach with a quart of water. You can put it in a bucket and put a rag in that and wash your countertops off, or you could put it in a spray bottle. Now, bleach will bleach your clothes if it touches it, so that's an issue with that. You can also use things like a Lysol spray or a Clorox wipe to sanitize surfaces. Another thing is when you wash dishes, you want to wash in really hot soapy water, and that water needs to be 140 degrees. That's pretty hot. You're probably going to want to put on some rubber gloves to wash dishes in that hot of water. You can also use an automatic dishwasher that has the heat drying portion on. You know, you can turn heat drying on your dishwasher. That will get the temperature hot enough. And then another big thing is your dish rags and your sponges. You need to keep them clean. People use the same sponges over and over again, and they get gross because there's little crevices and the bacteria can crawl up in there and the sponge stays wet. And people use a dish rag for a long period of time. There are some ways to clean sponges. There was a research study done by USDA, and they found if you put a wet sponge in the microwave for 1 minute, that would destroy about 99.9% of the bacteria. Also, placing the sponge in the dishwasher with the heat drying cycle on also destroyed about 99.9% of the bacteria. They also rinsed the sponge in some bleach water, and that didn't get as much of the bacteria, only between 40 and 85%, and it's because the bleach didn't get up and soak into all the crevices with that. So just remember, sponges and dish towels and dish rags can harbor bacteria. You need to change them out often and wash them. Now, along with keeping things clean, our next step is to separate our foods. Foods should be kept separate to keep the bacteria from crossing over from one food to another. So for example, if you are cutting raw chicken on a cutting board, and then you use that same cutting board to then cut carrots that you're going to put in a salad, you've just contaminated the carrots with the raw chicken juice. And most people won't do that. They'll wash the cutting board in between. But some I see is people go out to grill hamburgers and they put raw hamburgers on a plate, and then they put those hamburgers on the grill. And then when the hamburgers are done, they put those cooked hamburgers back on the plate that had the raw hamburger on it. You've now just contaminated the cooked hamburger with the raw hamburger juice on the plate. Or sometimes people will bring meat home and they'll put it in the refrigerator, and it will start to thaw, and those juices will drip down, say, on the produce that's in the refrigerator. Those are all cross-contamination. So you want to keep food separate so it doesn't cross-contaminate. So use separate cutting boards. It's good to have a cutting board for meats and one for raw foods, and that you don't use them for the other things. If you're grilling, you know, get a clean plate to put the cooked food on. If you're buying meat and you're putting it in a refrigerator, put it in a container or something so that it can't drip down onto other foods that are below it. Now, we've been talking about describing microbial food poisoning and foods that are troublesome and ways we could prevent it. We talked about cleaning and we talked about separating. We're now going to talk about cooking and chilling, and particular temperatures that I would like you to know that help prevent foodborne illness. So the next step that we're talking about is cooking, and you want to cook foods to the right temperature to destroy bacteria. You want to keep hot foods hot once you cooked it. And the only way to tell if you've cooked food to the right temperature is to use a thermometer. And by the way, the little thermometers in turkeys that you get around Thanksgiving time that pop up are notoriously incorrect. So you want to buy a thermometer that you can take a temperature up. There are many different food thermometers you can get. A digital thermometer is probably the best one. You can even buy it at the grocery store. They're very inexpensive. Now, once you get the thermometer, you need to know what temperature to cook the foods to. All temperatures that we are talking about are in Fahrenheit, and I want you to know these temperatures. So foods that need to be cooked to 145 degrees Fahrenheit include steaks and roasts from beef, lamb, veal, and pork. So if it's a steak or roast, it's a whole intact piece of muscle. And in addition to those, fish. Foods that you want to cook to 160 degrees Fahrenheit include ground meat, ground beef, ground pork, ground veal, ground lamb, and also egg dishes, so scrambled eggs. And then the last category to know are foods that need to be cooked to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. This includes all poultry, whether it's whole, intact, or ground, stuffings and casseroles, and any leftovers. Now, a lot of people wonder, why can you cook a steak to a rare temperature, but you can't cook a hamburger? It has to do with the intact piece of muscle. So a steak is an intact piece of muscle, so we can have bacteria on the outside, but not on the inside. But if I then take that steak, or I take a roast and I grind it for, say, hamburger, I've now mixed everything from the outside to the inside, and now I can get bacteria on the inside as well as the outside. And so I need a hotter temperature to make sure that I've gotten all the bacteria that can be potentially in that meat destroyed so that it's safe to eat. Just a word about leftovers. You know, once you cook food up to the temperature it's supposed to be, if you have leftovers and you put it in the refrigerator, any leftover has to be reheated back to 165, not to the original temperature. And by the way, you should use leftovers within about 4 days. Okay, going along this concept of temperatures, let's talk about chilling food. You need to refrigerate food promptly and keep cold foods cold, and on the flip side, hot foods hot. We have what's called the danger zone, and this is an important concept in food safety. So the danger zone is a temperature range where bacteria grow really rapidly. In fact, bacteria can double about every 20 minutes. The danger zone is between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So food should be kept at 40 or below, or at 140 or above for the home consumers. If you've taken a restaurant class, you might have different numbers than this, because restaurants have a different danger zone than the home consumer, but the home consumer numbers are 40 to 140. You can only keep food in the danger zone, or you should only keep food in the danger zone for less than 2 hours. Okay, so if you're cooking a meal, you're going to eat that's going to be in the danger zone, because room temperature is about 70, but you just don't want food in the danger zone for any more than 2 hours. So keep it hot or keep it cold, or get it out of the danger zone. Now, related to the danger zone is thawing of food. So if you freeze something, you want to make sure that when you thaw it appropriately, because you do not want that food in the danger zone for a long period of time. So let's say you have a Thanksgiving turkey. It takes about 24 hours to thaw 5 pounds of meat. So if you have a 20-pound turkey, you need to plan 4 to 5 days to thaw that turkey appropriately. So the preferred method to thaw is in the refrigerator. You take the meat or whatever it is out of the freezer, you put it in the refrigerator and give it ample time to thaw. If you've forgotten to do that, let's say maybe you want a hamburger for dinner and you take a hamburger patty out of the freezer, one thing you can do is thaw it in the microwave, but you need to cook it immediately after that. And that is because microwaves cook unevenly, and so parts of the meat could get warm and get into that danger zone where other parts are not completely thawed. So once you put it in the microwave, you need to cook it so that we get it up to the correct temperature to destroy any of the bacteria that might be there. A third thing is you can run meat under cold running water, and you just run it over the top of the meat, cover the meat in plastic wrap, and you run it over that, and you don't set it in the water for a long period of time, but you just keep running it under cold water, and that's another way to thaw. When we're talking about food safety, we want to talk about takeout foods and leftovers as well. It's important to remember the danger zone with these foods. So you go to a restaurant to eat, and now you have leftovers and you take them home. How are you going to keep them safe? Or if you order food? Well, you can remember what's called the 2-2-4 rule of leftover safety. And that is, within 2 hours of cooking, you want to refrigerate the food and keep it cold. You also want to put the food in a shallow container that's no more than 2 inches deep. So if you made a big pot of chicken noodle soup and you didn't eat all of it, pour it into like a 9x13 cake pan that's, you know, no more than 2 inches deep, and cool it off, and then you can put it back in a big container. That's because in a big container, you can't get the center of it cool. But if it's shallow, you have more surface area and you can cool it off. So refrigerate it within 2 hours, put it in a shallow container that's less than 2 inches deep. And the last one is to eat it within 4 days or toss it out. And I think a lot of people probably do not follow that rule. I think people leave their leftovers for a little longer than they should.